Good evening, everybody. So as you know, the talk this evening is on practical strategies to help support manage everyday activities. So for any of you that might know me already, you may know that I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I completed my PhD in the area of DCD. I was sponsored by the Health Research Board, which is our national funding body that funds public health research. So it's incredible that actually they funded my research in the area of DCD. And I suppose it also highlights that actually, you know, at a national level, there is more being shone on the light of population health and health service research for people, children and young people with DCD. So my PhD would have looked at what are the interventions that are most effective at improving the physical and mental health of children and young people with DCD. If you're interested in any of the publications, they're on my website, which is www.otforlife.ie, or feel free to follow me on Instagram or on Twitter. So I'm going to talk to you tonight. Much of the presentation this evening will include, I haven't made it heavily referenced because it is, I want it to be a practical webinar this evening. So a lot of the information though that I'm giving you is very heavily situated within what is the evidence for what we should be doing for children and young people, and also clinical experience as well. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll kick off. As I said at the start, for anybody who's just come in, please feel free to pop any questions into the chat box. I would love to take questions for the second part of the webinar, because I think the talk tonight is practical strategies. And I don't think sometimes the best practical strategies are actually when you ask the questions, because I can give strategies, but it's only when you ask the questions that we can look at how you individualize that. And certainly for all the years that I've worked in children's services and with families and teachers, parents' questions are just the best. They really are. So do feel free to ask questions. Sorry, Sharon, do you mind just enabling me as a host so that just for the screen share, just to pop it on that we could, you know, the box at the bottom so that you can just click that from one. Oh yeah, there we go. Super, thank you. Now, off we go. So as I said this evening, it's going to be lots of tips for children and adolescents with DCD, dyspraxia. I suppose you will hear me use the word DCD a lot. As we all know, dyspraxia is the layperson's term as we describe it, but DCD is the diagnostic terminology. I suppose because I've been situated from research for a long point, I tend to use DCD probably as much as I do dyspraxia. So what do we know about DCD? All of you here this evening as parents or working with a child with DCD, you will know so much about what you see in front of you every day, okay? So all those challenges with motor skills, and then sometimes the strengths with the child's motor skills as well. Also the strengths and challenges around social skills, the cognitive challenges with regard to organizational skills, planning and organizing, and also the emotional difficulties, the mental health. So we know now from the research that actually, yes, whilst DCD is a motor-based learning disorder, we know that actually children with DCD are also at risk of experiencing mental health difficulties. And when we say mental health difficulties, what the research tells us is anxiety and depression. It's not to say that every child and young person will, but there's an increased risk of it. So it's no different that if I have increased blood pressure, I'm at greater risk of something else, okay? So it's not to say we don't, but I suppose why I highlight it is because particularly for anybody working with children with DCD is that there's a lot we can do to prevent and to reduce that risk around mental health. And the first piece being, so for everybody's here tonight, is awareness and understanding. Because when we have a much greater awareness around DCD, it changes our interactions, and that has a huge knock-on effect for the child or adolescent with DCD. But motor skills, we know that as probably one of the most prevalent and obvious pieces, especially it's the diagnostic criteria that, you know, the child's motor skills are not in line with their chronological age. When we say chronological age, that basically the motor skills, they're not the same as their peers, that they're at a different level with it. And then the second piece then for the diagnostic criteria is that those motor skills impact on activities of daily living. So that is what you will see at home in everyday life. So a child maybe who finds it tricky to maybe eat their dinner without spilling it, or pack their school bag, brush their teeth, get ready in the morning, get out the door, put on their seatbelt. And maybe they might have some challenges with learning to swim or to cycle. And then you might also notice real pockets of strength where actually they've really practiced a specific skill or activity and that they're really good at. And that can be a real kind of challenge then to go, well, are they definitely dyspraxic? Because actually they're great at rollerblading, or they're really good at, you know, another activity. But it's when we look at the overall picture, do the motor skill difficulties impact on activities of daily living? Okay, so it's that wider piece, okay? And that we know then that also that those difficulties occurred in the early years, the onsets in the early developmental period, and that finally then that there's no other underlying neurological condition that could better explain the motor difficulties. So often these challenges are noticed in the early childhood period, okay? So those early years, often it can be kind of when the child is going into first class, periods of transition, you know, where the expectation goes up and we expect children to be able to manage more activities. So sometimes you might notice a little bit of challenge in kind of like the younger years of 5, 6, when they're in junior, senior infants. But then it's more so that actually as they get older that you're noticing, oh yeah, they really struggle with that piece of it. So things like, you know, tying shoelaces, buttoning, fine motor skills for playing and manipulating, you know, eating their dinner, cutting, all those real everyday activities. So as I said at the start, the secondary consequences that we see because of these motor skill difficulties are the functional difficulties. So maybe challenges with engaging in sport and being involved in them, maybe some difficulties with toileting or a messy eat or handwriting or dressing. And the impact then of that can be that you might see behavioral responses. And those behavioral responses can often be that piece of that they might avoid playing with peers, or they might avoid social situations, or they might actually kind of become more of, you know, a joker or a messer, okay? Or they might display disruptive behavior, or they may also be bullied by others. So when we talk about the increased risk of mental health difficulties, it's because of these behavioral responses that we see it. We know that for children with DCD, the risk of being bullied is much higher because often other children will say things, they might marginalize the child, so like exclude them from activities or tease them. And bullying has a severe and long-term impact on our mental health. So if there is any child that you're working with, or, you know, that where you actually see that, then it is really important that we address that really early on. It's also really important that we address the piece around friendships, so that actually for children who avoid playing with peers, that we ask as therapists, as SNA, as parents, who do you play with in school? That we ask the teachers, you know, who do they play with on the yard? That they're not avoiding those situations or being the joker or being disruptive, because actually motor skills really influence our play in the early years. We need those skills so that we can join play. And if we struggle with those skills, we might need a little bit more scaffolding to actually help with our play and interaction with peers. And then, as we said, the consequences of that can be the mental health consequences, which are the social emotional consequences of reduced self-esteem, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. So as we lead into the next piece, so going straight into, right, we've looked at where the areas of challenge can be. So what can we do? What are the tips and strategies that we want to do? So the first major tip that I would always talk about and strategy is adapt the environment. So there's 3 different levels that we want to adapt the environment. We want to adapt the environment physically, okay? So if it's a physical activity like we're doing PE, we want to make that much more visible for the child, that actually they know exactly where they're going to have to run between what cones, because we want to make the environment easier to actually, we don't want things in their way when they're doing things, because children with DCD will have challenges with spatial awareness and navigating the environment. So the first bit is that we're always thinking about that physical environment. How do we adapt it and make it easier for children to actually navigate the environment, find things, get around it? The second environmental factor is that social environment, okay? Really, really important, especially when you talk to children and young people with DCD. They want friends, they want social interactions. So then we have to adapt the social environment. How do they interact in the classroom? So children make friends by doing things with others, by playing. They don't just set out to make friends. That's how they become friends, is that sense of social belonging. And often that happens in the classroom by just working together, being involved in projects, SESE or art or ASHTR or geography, whatever it is. So we need to scaffold it for the child. If they find that tricky, how do we reduce the demands on them? Like, so if they have to present their news or dinner na seachtain or whatever it is, how will we make that more accessible for them, the social environment for it, and reduce the demands there? So simple things of like, can they present by sitting in their own seat, or, can somebody else come up with them? If they find those things tricky, what are the simple strategies that socially we can do? And then culture, the culture environment. And this is a huge piece that children and young people will tell us, that, they'll say the teacher gets cross at me or frustrated, or I know I'm just a nuisance. So that's the cultural environment. So actually by us understanding and have a better understanding of the needs of children with DCD, it changes our perceptions of the child. And if we change our perception of the children that we're in company with or that we work with, then we don't experience that sense of frustration, because there isn't as much of a gap. It's like you wouldn't expect me to be able to read the presentation here in front of me without having my glasses on. And if I didn't have my glasses on, you might get really frustrated with me if I was messing around with it and like it wasn't flowing, okay? Whereas if you actually understood that, I was after breaking my glasses and I couldn't wear them, so I couldn't see it properly, you'd be a little bit more understanding and kind of like, look, she can't, it's not her fault. So understanding is so important, because it really shifts the cultural awareness in our environments. Okay. The next piece then that we're looking about is, we've spoken about the environment. We want to adapt the activity, okay? So when we're thinking about adapting the activity, okay, the first piece that we think is most activities that where kids need to be independent, they involve motor skills, okay? So the most important thing that I can say to you tonight is, for your child that you're working with, or, if you're like, obviously not as a parent, you're not working with them, is actually just to identify what is the exact skill or the activity that your child has difficulty with. So you might be able to like sit back for a little bit, after this webinar, and think about what are the things that they're really good at, that they actually enjoy. And then think about the areas that are challenging, and maybe list them all down, or bullet point them, or chat them through with a partner or another family member or friend, okay? And then pick, what is your priority right now? What's important to you, okay? And then look at that and go, is that important to my child? Is that something they want to work on? Okay, because that's really, really important, that goal setting piece, okay? And identifying one thing, because if we identify too many things, the risk is that we're trying to work on too many things at once. And imagine if your boss or somebody, came home in an evening time and said to you, have you done this, 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 and this, and you need to improve this, this, and this, and we're going to work on them all now. You'd be just overwhelmed. So that's why it's so important, the piece around goal setting. And for anybody who wants any resources on goal setting, I'd say to you, have a look at the Ken Child website. They have loads of resources on DCD, but they have lots of resources on what they call the F words, okay? So that's looking at things like function, family, friends, all the key priority areas. And it can just help you to break down and identify your goal. They have lots of templates there, and it'll be under the F words. So then thinking about the activity or the skill that you want to work on, okay? So you might want to work on ball skills, okay? Because the activity might be that actually you do want them to go to whatever the training activity is, be that rugby or football or karate, okay? So whatever it is, okay, that you want your child to actually be able to engage in, you might need to practice some of those skills first of all. So you kind of need to think about, well, what is the impact at home, in school, or out in the community when they're playing, okay? And think about how you scaffold it, okay? Try to think about, like, why can't they do it, okay? Is there a specific behavior linked to it? So, like, have they poor motivation because they kind of think it's hard work and they don't want to practice it, okay? So thinking about then, if there's a behavior linked to it, how do we address that behavior as well? How do we make it more motivating or more engaging? And it might be that we pick maybe another activity where they're still practicing the same skills. So then thinking about what you can do. So you want to think about function and practice. So as we said at the very start, dyspraxia is a motor-based learning disorder. So motor practice is going to be the best bit, okay? But when we think about motor-based practice, okay, so if you're teaching something like ball skills, okay, and we'll say it is, I've been trying to teach, I am no amazing hurler, I can tell you, and I've been trying to teach my little young fella how to hold the hurley, which is hilarious because he holds it sideways, upside down, you name it, every way but the proper way to hold it, okay? So the first bit is like looking at what we actually want to teach them. Do you have the skills to teach it, and do you know how to break it down? So for children with DCD, they really rely quite heavily on that visual system to learn, okay? Because I don't want to get too into the neurology of it tonight, because that's a whole other talk. But I suppose just when you're thinking about a tip for teaching practice of motor skills, always show the child a visual of it first of all. So if you can put up a YouTube video or if you can record it on your phone and sit down and watch together so that they can actually analyze it. Well, what is Mammy doing there? Like, how is she holding the hurley? How does she hit the ball? How do you do it? What does it look like? So it's really important from a learning point of view that they have lots of opportunities to actually look and see, because that is where children with DCD will have some difficulties, okay? So first of all, given that visual piece, and then breaking it down into the actual practice. How do you go out and practice it at home or in the garden or in the community, or who in school is, okay? So I suppose that's the support. Like, will it be you that is doing all this practice? Is there somebody in school that can help? Is there another family member? Is there a friend, you know, a local club that they go to? So I suppose there's some practical examples there, but that I've given kind of like around, you know, sport more so. But do think of how does the skill that you want him to develop to relate to the activity, and vice versa. Think of the activity that you want to improve or enhance, and think of the skills needed for it. Now, I suppose I'm flying through all of this and I'm reaming it off. Like, this is my job. I am trained to analyze activities. I spent 3 years at it in my undergraduate degree, okay? So when I say about analyzing an activity, that's really, really complex stuff, because you're analyzing what are the motor skills that are needed. But we also have to analyze, look, what are the cognitive skills like attention, concentration, motivation? What are the psychological pieces, that piece around motivation and emotional? So if you find that like you're trying to do this and you're like, oh, it's just not working, that is where I would say to you, if you can get any support from an occupational therapist and sit down with them to have a consultation, to actually set your goal and then really break that goal down to look at like, what's the reality of this look like at home or in school? Like, where are the child's strengths? What's working well at the moment? What isn't working, okay? And then look at, okay, well, what are the opportunities now for practice? So really teasing this out. And this could take a good hour or maybe 2 hours over 2 sessions, okay? So you're really teasing out what are going to be the opportunities for it. So that then you can identify, well, what's the way forward? What are we going to do? What are the next steps? And there'll be loads of strategies within that. Okay. So the key to success, I suppose, is teaching skills in a graded and supportive manner. So some of it there, as I've been talking to you, I've been kind of really saying that piece around, the breaking down of the activity, identifying the goal and seeking supports from people like an OT, okay? But also when you think about it in a supportive manner, none of us want to be told that we have to do something. We just don't respond well at all to like those real kind of rigid instructions. So that's where collaboration is so important, of actually chatting to a teenager, chatting to your 5-year-old and saying, look, like, do you want to be able to make your own sandwich, or wouldn't it be nice to? So actually bringing them on board and actually chatting to them, because they're going to be doing hard work. So if we feel like we're part of the conversation, we want to coach them to actually come on board with us. So what are they going to be doing? Okay. So the second part now that I'm going to take you through, okay, is this piece around activities, when we're adapting activities, okay, is that like you can help the child to improve their motor skills through activities, okay, but also think about really simple things that you do at home. So those everyday chores that you do, of like emptying the dishwasher, having to close the car door themselves, having to open the car door, having to lift out their school bag, all of those things. And really thinking about, when I said there a few moments ago of like looking at the goal, but little by little, okay? Because if we take on too much, it's too much for the child, and it's too much as well for us as parents. You just can't do it. I'll give you a good laugh. It's definitely over a year ago anyway, but obviously I'm an OT, and I think OTs must be, I don't know if we're terrible parents, like we're awful to live with, or if it makes it any better. I think sometimes worse. But anyway, so when I take the kids to school in the morning time, now my kids are young, right? I always make them put their bags out into the car themselves, because, like being the OT, we've got to promote independence, and, that encourages them having to think about like the organization of it. And it teaches them so many skills of just actually being organized themselves. Okay. So I obviously hadn't brought the kids to school for a couple of weeks, because we rotated between myself and my husband, and who starts early and who finishes early. So I said to the kids, off out to the car now, guys, off with you. I hop into the car, they're in the car. I didn't take any notice to say, have you got your school bags? So we get to school and there is absolutely no school bag in the car. And where I live, there's a good bit of traffic. So it's not like you can turn around easily and think I'll just nip home and get the school bags. And I was like, guys, where's your school bags? It's like, come on, you're supposed to put them in the car now. Always do this. They're like, no, Daddy always brings out our school bags for us. Well, all I could do was laugh, send them into school with no school bag, and then go home, get the school bags and bring them back, and then say to my husband at a later point going, you can't do that. Like, you can't be creating dependency. It's not fair. So you can see how in the space of a couple of like, literally, I don't think it was 3 weeks. I think it was probably only about 2 weeks that he'd been doing the mornings, of how they got it out of the habit and the routine of it. And so Dad had adapted the environment and the routine, and Dad now was chief organizer and responsible for it. So, working memory and all of those bits will go very quickly for any child. So we've got to provide the opportunities for them to actually do it. And that's where like simple chores. I'm not talking the big bits, because I know how tricky it is to get kids to do any shape of a job for you. I mean, just the small things that you can do. Why do I say that? I suppose I say that because actually in the teenage years, what we notice is that children have more difficulties with executive functioning skills. So we notice in the early years for children with DCD that often the predominant challenge is around the motor piece, okay? And then because that evolves in the adolescence years, we see more about executive function skills. So they're all the frontal lobe, high level skills that do all the planning and the organizing, okay? And as the motor skills are developing in the younger years, they're laying down opportunities to develop these higher level skills, okay? So that's why from literally the age of 5 and younger, when they're in preschool, we want to be giving them opportunity to practice the development of these high level skills. Because all these high executive functioning skills, okay, the frontal lobe ones for planning, organization, remembering, doing, they have huge growth spurts from the ages of 5 to 7. And then kind of like, yes, they keep going up along, but then they have another peak of a growth spurt in the teenage years again. And they don't fully stop maturing until kind of like mid-20s. So that's for all of us, okay? So thinking about like, you know, when a baby is learning to walk, we give them so much opportunity to practice and we're like, oh, well done, great. And we clap and we encourage them. And we sometimes forget about that for the brain skills because we can't see it, okay? And when kids aren't getting it, it can be really frustrating for adults around them. Now, this piece around executive functioning skills, that's a whole webinar in itself, okay? But I suppose the piece that we will notice as parents and as therapists and as educators is that like they'll maybe procrastinate, last minute starting things, forgetting things. So that is why we want to put in lots of opportunity for practice, okay? And when I say about practice, okay, remember what we said the top 3 strategies are: adapt the environment and the activity and teach the performance skills, okay? So if we're adapting the environment for cooking, it might be, how do we set that up? So that's setting up the physical environment for what does it look like when I have to make my own sandwich or I'm making pancakes, okay? So really scaffolding that piece of what equipment will I need? What are all the things I will need out? Do I need a checklist, okay? And explaining to the young person, why am I using a checklist? So that I remember all the instructions, that I don't forget anything. And then in with that as well, then we'll put in, what does the cleanup look like? What does tidying up? So that's the self-monitoring piece, okay? So that's a really high brain skill that we use, where we check our own behavior, okay? Because that's what allows us to be independent and responsible, because we can monitor ourselves, okay? So I know over the years, so many parents have said that to me. It's like, yeah, it's fine getting them to practice, but then what about the aftermath of like, you know, you've twice as much left. So that's part of it. Or else we identify really clearly as part of the scaffolding that, okay, they're going to do the first part and we do the tidy up. But over time, you know, that we'll be building in that as well. So how do we support teenagers then to gain independence? The exact same as when we're thinking about younger children with the performance of motor skills, okay? Sitting down with them, talking it out and identifying what are the exact skills and activities that they want to improve, to be able to do, to be independent with, because otherwise we're just going to have resistance. And agree and set the goal together, because collaboration is key. And getting them to think about how does it impact on home life. So think about like, what is it like for mom or dad or their, you know, whoever is there, you know, their guardian, you know, if there's a lot of frustration and giving out to each other. So like, is that the piece that you want to impact, that everybody's going to try, so that we're not actually hopping off of each other? Try to think, why can't they do it? And then think about what they could do. Think about the practice, the function and the independence. Who else can support? So like if it's anything around homework or study skills, I always say, is there anybody else that can support that? And one of the most important things I would say to you is celebrate success, no matter how small. Because the worst bit is that you're working on something and nobody notices it. So then finally, just before we finish up, so yeah, we're thinking about how we actually help to encourage young people to manage and to enhance everyday activities and tasks and skills. But I suppose it's also that piece of that, like, I'm very conscious that, It's not all parents' responsibility. You can't be everything to everybody. You can't be parent and therapist works. So like actually our health policy and education policies are there, and they do say that actually children have rights. They have rights to actually, to actually achieve outcomes that lets them gain friendships, improve their performance and skills that promote their independence. So if you want to have a quick Google and look at like the outcome statements for children, that is on the back of Progressing Disability Services health policy. So don't be afraid to actually look at them to know what outcomes, you should be achieving, because those documents are really well researched. They're developed, yes, by health policymakers, but also parents. Parents have been stakeholders in those as well, so that you can actually say to service providers, because I'm so conscious that it is very tricky for parents to access services. And often when health professionals are advocating that waiting lists are long and that we need more, that maybe doesn't have as strong a voice as parents. But equally, I understand the challenge that parents are faced by advocating that it can be so tiresome. So do, link with other people, link with your local policymaker, your local politician, to actually, get them to do the advocating for you. And that's the references that back up this evening's presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can go back to the piece around questions and anything else then around linking in then of any questions you might have linked to those top tips. Sorry, I'm just trying to change my screens here. I can't see anything for a second, so just bear with me for a minute.
While you're doing that, Aine, I'll just let you know there's a number of questions that have come in. Some of them are quite high level. So okay. I hope I'm not going to put you on the spot too much. We'll try and get through these. The first one that I have here is for a 10-year-old who can't cope with the change in plans. He has a meltdown if something is cancelled or if a time is changed. He has friends in school, but prefers to be by himself at break time. And is this common with DCD?
Okay, so you said he's 10?
Yes.
Okay.
10-year-old boy.
It's really, really common, okay? So when you think about, like I just touched on it there, of like, he finds it tricky when plans are changed, okay? So that's all those high level frontal lobe skills that I was talking about. So that's all the planning and prioritization, okay, and problem solving, okay? So if you've got difficulties with those skills, okay, so think about what it's like for us as adults. You know the way, like I always use Dublin, it's the example, okay? But in the past, when I would go to Dublin, I would drive, okay? And then you would have to try and navigate crazy traffic. I don't know the route inside out, okay? So my problem solving skills are poor to be able to navigate how to react quickly, okay? Change is horrific for me when I drive to Dublin, when there's a lane closed or there's roadworks or something else. And I don't cope with it amazingly. I'll usually leave an extra half an hour so that I don't have to meet whatever meeting I'm going into straight away, so that I can actually have half an hour to regulate, okay? So that's me as an adult, okay? But I'm highly aware of my executive functioning skills. So this 10-year-old boy is actually saying, I find change really difficult, but he can't articulate that actually it's the change in the plan. He doesn't know what's going to happen. So that's why OTs will talk so much about checklists and using them. So it's not about a visual schedule for communication. It's about actually knowing what's going to happen. Or maybe that's about having a chat with the SNA or his SET teacher, that he knows exactly if plans are going to change, that somebody sits down with him and explains to him, what's this going to look like, what will I be doing, and maybe draw it out for him so that he can see it, okay? Some of the reason you're saying to me, isn't it lovely that he has friendships? Because whenever I talk to OTs, I'm always saying we need to be asking parents the question of, does the child have friends? Because that's where we want to be intervening. Clearly on the yard, he's seeking an opportunity to self-regulate. So time to calm, compose himself. No different to the example that I give you when I'm a bit stressed after dealing with all that traffic. I go and have a coffee on my own. So he's taking time out to regulate. So it's looking at in the school situation. When I'm talking to teachers, I'll often say to them, can they do something kind of like an emotional regulation strategy for the whole class? Because they do this anyway as part of the well-being curriculum, okay? Can they do something like a progressive muscular relaxation, which literally takes 3 minutes? And it's just where you go through literally each muscle in the body group where you relax and contract the muscles. If you Google it, you'll be able to see it, and you can pull up a script for children. And it's a really nice activities that sometimes teachers will do before the kids go out to break, because it regulates everybody. So that when they go out to break, because break has a really important component of, yes, physical activity, but also social interaction, so that he's actually calmer before he goes out to break. So look, I know that may not be specific enough, and there's a lot there. So I would also say for any of these questions, that I'm answering tonight, I'm answering them briefly. Do see if you have any opportunity to link back in with your OT, because this is actually the kind of stuff that you want to be asking them. You don't necessarily want a session for your child. You want a consultation so that you can help them to manage at home. And we know from the research that when parents can coach better, parents' well-being is enhanced as well, so they have a better understanding of their child's needs. Okay, next question.
Very well answered, and very, very, very true. From my own personal experience, I would say that's absolutely spot on. The more you learn as a parent, the more confident you are, and the more you actually do help your child. Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Another question here. I would love to hear some practical tips for children starting post-primary school, how to organize school bags, lockers, and getting used to class timetables. And I'll just preempt that, because that again could be an entire webinar on its own. And we do have a book on our website. It's called The Next Adventure, Transitioning from Primary to Secondary School. So I'm not expecting you to go into a whole range of things here, Anya, because that again would take all evening. But is there anything in particular parents should be considering for when their children are transitioning from primary to secondary school?
Okay, the first bit I'm going to say is to reiterate what Sharon has said there, of like, actually that book is so well priced, buy that book immediately. It's so well written by Dorothy Armstrong. It's an amazing resource. So and buy it so that actually your child can read it as well. So the first piece is around, Dorothy's research highlighted that really clearly, the children going into post-primary school who understand that they may have some difficulties. So children who have a greater understanding of it do better, okay? So why do those kids do better, okay, when they have an awareness of their diagnosis and where they need support? They do better because they're able to ask for help. They're able to ask for help at home from their parents. They're able to talk about it, and the same in the school setting. So the first part is actually having that chat about secondary school and saying, look, what kind of things are you good at? Like, what kind of things aren't? And then talk about it so comfortably, and like on, like I really would struggle without my phone diary. So like everything is in Google Calendar. Like I would have nothing in it. So looking at what's the first piece that we're going to tackle, okay? So that's the piece about identifying the goal. For people who are transitioning to secondary school, organisation skills, as I said, it's a whole webinar. Try and link in and get at least one session with an OT around that, to break down the different activities, because what you've got there is you've multiple activities around the school bag. How do we do that? You have teaching them how to use a timetable. Can you teach them how to use even a real simple timetable at home, like actually just getting a whiteboard and putting up what are we doing for the week? So even though it might seem a bit formulaic, but actually that you're sending them back to that. Many kids will detest checklists. They will be allergic to them, okay? Because thinking about their age as well, okay? And that is where you need to jazz it up a bit. They're coming to that age of where they possibly maybe have a smartphone or another device, okay? Even if they don't have the internet on it, get them starting to use it on an app that's funky and cool versus actually a checklist, because the bottom line is their executive functioning skills are going through a growth spurt. If there's any bit of a delay there at all, they don't have the working memory and the planning skills. So it's got to be there, bullet pointed down in a checklist. But you've got to figure out, how is this palatable to the young person? You know, like, it's not palatable for me to be going around with a paper diary, because I'd never have the paper diary on me when I need it. So will they always have their phone in their back pocket? You know, I know phones aren't allowed in schools. I know there, but I also know that most teenagers end up going into school with a phone. So it's about being strategic of how we use them as well. So I suppose to answer that question, go back to summarize it. First of all, purchase Dorothy's book and leave it there so that the child and young person in your house can read it as well, because there's lovely excerpts there from teenagers talking about it. The second piece is sitting down going, what activity are we going to tackle first of all? Is it the piece around their school bag for primary school, or is it for secondary school? For anybody who's actually interested in it, Dublin West Education Centre, I'm also running a series of webinars for them on DCD. It's a 7-week course. It's free. Parents can register, and we've only completed 2 weeks. So the ones on organizational skills will be coming up. So anybody who wants to register for that as well, it's a webinar there on its own that you can register for. Okay. Sorry, Sharon, you're just on mute there. You're still on mute, Sharon.
I can ask a question. There was one here that I picked out. Hang on. One that's coming up a lot, we've had a few times, which I know is a bit of a hard one, but is, I guess, a brief one on how to explain to kind of under 12-year-olds that they have dyspraxia, and people are just looking for tips and ideas.
Okay, so I suppose that's the base where, like, everybody knows their child best, okay? I would never say an age to a parent of when to say it to them, when not to, because you know your child best and you know how to talk to them. So there's some lovely books out there and resources now that you can get, okay? And then I'd start talking to them in really simple terms. So things that you notice at home for them, like, what are the bits for them that are tricky, okay? And told them that thing, you know, sometimes like your hands maybe don't open the buttons for you on your shirt or tie them as quickly as you want them to do. And that's because actually, you know, the message from your brain isn't getting to the muscles. It's taken the wrong road. It's gone off down around the country roads instead of going via the motorway. And I'll use all different types of kind of explanations depending on the child to try and just explain like that it's not them, it's just that their brain learns a bit differently. And that's why we practice it, but also really tapping into the fact of like, what are their strengths? That it's not, don't get me wrong here, but it's not all about dyspraxia. What other things do they like? What's their passion? What do they want to do? What's their favorite cartoons that they watch? Because when you talk to young people with DCD, that's what they'll say to you. They're like, going, yeah, I have dyspraxia, but like, it's grand. So for them, it's not all about DCD. So yes, having simple little conversations. You don't have to tell them in everything in one go. It's not about sitting down and saying to them, this is your diagnosis. It's just having simple little conversations along the way so that as they get older, and then when they want to ask the questions, they can come back and go, well, is that why this is it? You know, so that you're really just normalizing it, making it part of everyday life. What do you think, Faye? Is there anything else you'd like to add there? Because I know you have a lot of experience with that as well.
Like, I think, like, just personally, when I was told I had dyspraxia at 14, like, I did not want to know. Like, that was great, and like, I don't care, so off you go, and I don't want to meet anyone with dyspraxia, know anything about dyspraxia. And then when I decided myself at 16 or 17, actually, I think I'll meet some people with dyspraxia, and I went to the group or an activity or whatever, to a library or something we did, kayaking and something. And I remember meeting people with dyspraxia for the first time and thinking, God, they don't have 6 heads and 5 arms and they're just like me. And it was good. Like, so I think it just takes time when the child or teen are ready, you know?
Absolutely. And like, two ways you say there, Faye, like you were 14, so very aware, like, you know, that age of adolescence. So like when people are saying kind of like tips for younger people, like I'd say like if you can introduce it earlier, do, because it just makes it very like, well, sure, this is it. And then you can start identifying people that, you know, well, you know, so-and-so, like he does too. Or do you ever notice anybody else at training that finds that tricky? Because you can be guaranteed that whatever activity you go to, like the rate of prevalence of dyspraxia is 1 in 20. So for any group that you're at, like 1 in 20, there's going to be somebody else there as well.
And I think Caged in Chaos is a good book I liked as a teenager. It's a good one.
It's fabulous.
One.
Yeah, absolutely. And like now I think as well with social media, there's like, okay, you have to be really careful around what your child is looking at, but go check out some sites because that's where there's some brilliant blogs as well. Like there's some lovely people to follow that have really nice blogs who write about their dyspraxia.
There's a few questions there, Anya, about parents where their children are a bit immature, maybe not hanging out with children their age, and is that okay? Is that normal? And again, if similar to the last question, if they don't want to hang out with people after school, they're grand in school, but after school, they don't want to mix with their peers.
So I suppose, okay, there's 2 pieces to that question. The first piece around is the piece around immaturity. So just thinking around all those high level skills around, you know, problem solving, cognitive flexibility, planning, organization. That's what allows us to be mature, because that's those high level skills that actually allow us to follow the conversation, to keep up with it, to see what's going on, you know. And if that's tricky and kids are having to work really hard with it, they'll often revert back to playing with younger peers because the demands aren't as high. The play is a bit more simple. So they don't have to engage in that real kind of like cognitive piece around the fact that, and especially as kids kind of hit the age of 9, 10, like the rules of the games are changing. And it's like, why? Like, it's so hard to keep up with it. Or like the conversation has changed 4 times. So that's one of the reasons why children will revert back to playing with younger children, is that it's actually, there's less demands and it's easier. Sometimes kids don't want to play with their peers when they come home from school because actually they're just exhausted. So we know for children with DCD that from a neurological perspective, so like basically DCD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So that means there is atypical brain maturation in the early developmental period, okay? And the neural brains that are involved with DCD are those executive regions, as well as other motor regions. So it means that in the school setting, their brain is working so hard. And if your brain is working really hard, you are going to be really tired afterwards. So think about your first day in a job. Think about, like, whenever I finish a webinar, I'm always wrecked because it's really intense. I've been talking solidly for an hour. I take questions, okay? So that's the same for the child coming home from school. They've been on all day. And remember, they do not have a learning disability. So they will be highly aware and really compensate that they keep up with everybody in class. So when they come home, it's just like, often you're seeing the worst of the behavior because it's a safe space. You're seeing the meltdowns. And that's why we really need to look at the piece around cognitive fatigue. There's a recorded webinar on the Dyspraxia Ireland YouTube channel for that one, which I would have completed back early, probably about 6 months ago. So it might be worth having a look at that. And then I suppose the third piece then is, how do we create opportunities for peer interaction? So when's the best time for it? Are the weekends a better time? Like, you know, when they've had a break, you know, so looking at how we do that. Or is it that actually, sometimes we feel like kids have to be doing something like a couple of evenings a week. They don't. It's actually too demanding for them. So looking at it and prioritizing when is the time for social interaction. I'm also, it's funny, like I always feel like when I was saying there about like how, like I'm not lying, like after a webinar, you'd be wrecked. I can tell that it's coming up on the hour because I can tell that I'm starting to fade.
Absolutely. And you know, this is the best part though, Aine. It's the interaction with people. It's just, you know, the real life problems that people are facing every day. And we find that through our helpline, which Faye runs most of the time, you know, it's so varied, but it's every single question is so important. There's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to dyspraxia.
Not at all. And also the other side of it is that like, it's so individualized.
Yes.
That like actually the answer for each person needs to be, yes, it's the same maybe core principles, but actually it needs to be tweaked, your individual situation, your context and your activities. So it's never a stupid question kind of going, oh, did I hear them say that for somebody else? So like, I would always say, yeah, those pieces are so important.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions here that I think are really important. One is in relation to your piece about developing motor skill independence. And I've sort of grouped a couple of questions here together. So there tends to be, well, obviously there's a lot of different responses from children and young people, adolescents to this. One may be aversion and the other may be avoidance. And children who express aversion can have, you know, what we describe as the temper tantrums and the, you know, just the what might be called naughty behavior. And those who have avoidance strategies are somewhat even more difficult to deal with because they've actually learned to deal with it in different ways, some of which may not be healthy. So when we're talking about developing motor skill independence, how do parents sort of differentiate between those things?
Okay, so often kids, so the reasons why we'll have an aversion to it or avoidance of it is because it's hard work. We won't want to do it. And sometimes too, the avoidance bit is it's a protective strategy. We'll avoid it because we know it's difficult and we don't want to expose our weaknesses, okay? And particularly, you've got to remember that actually kids in front of their parents, they want their parents to be proud of them and to be seen, okay? So that is the piece around where, like I say, I studied on this for 3 years around occupational analysis, okay? So actually analyzing the activity. So if they're avoiding it or they're like literally allergic to it, you have to see how you can break that down into its simplest form. What's the first step that they can do? And then also using other strategies as well. Yes, we want to really, really break it down, okay? But then we want to really look at other strategies of like humor. Actually, how do we make it fun and have a laugh about it? So humor is so important, okay? Changing the context of it, that like, you know, it's like anything, you know, when you want, now it's easier for younger kids. I am really conscious that, so anybody here has got younger kids, I'd say start young. So, you know, it's something simple when they're small and you want them to empty the dishwasher and like their immediate reaction is like, no, I'm not doing it. And you're like, oh, give me patience, you know, and it's like, you know, how can you match that with something that's motivating? So let's put on a bit of music. Come on, look, we'll put on music and we'll have it done in a minute. And then that bit of working together for older kids. Okay, let's do it together. You do this bit, I'll do that bit. So that it's much more collaborative. If they're really allergic to the activity, then they're totally avoidant of it. That's where then you're trying to sit down with them and say, right, okay, I know you really don't want to do that, okay, but what activity will you do that's going to actually help to build your independence? So it might be, okay, they don't want to cook, but actually, okay, can you start helping with the laundry? So, you know, picking other ways around it. Or maybe they're really resistive to doing it with us as a parent. That's where sometimes they'll do it with somebody else who's a therapist or, you know, somebody in school, because it's just a different adult. It's not that they're better or worse or anything like that. It's just that they're, you know, it's somebody who can get around them and it's not their parent. So yeah, I hope that answers some of those pieces.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you. The next question I have here, my child has a coexisting condition. ADHD, do I need to put other strategies into place in addition to the ones you've talked about?
Not really. Like, I would think you really need to. So ADHD co-occurs a lot with DCD, okay? Because same brain areas that are involved, you'll have overlap, okay? So the things around then, we know that for children with ADD, their main area of children with ADD is executive functioning skills. So that's where you're really having to look at strategies around planning and organizational skills. So really looking at the types of planning and organizational skill strategies. So the likes of checklists. So I would say to you, maybe if you can join that webinar with Dublin West Education Centre, or in Dorothy's book, there's a lot in that around planning and organizational skill strategies as well.
Fantastic, thank you. There's so many questions flying in here, and I know we're just not going to have an opportunity to answer them all, and I'm so sorry to everyone that we can't answer their questions. But another theme that's coming through quite strongly is the social aspect. So a lot of parents who are concerned about their child either not having a social circle, avoiding a social circle, being too tired for a social circle. And I think you have touched on that in your explanation, that children with DCD do get tired. They get so tired so easily. So maybe I'll actually put that to you and Faye as a question, if that's okay.
I'm going to let you go first of all, Faye, because I think you've so much experience, like lived experience, but also like you meet so many people through your job every day with it.
I think so we're two questions here, the social and tiredness. The tiredness, I think, is just huge. And for me, as a child, as a teenager, getting to school, I was exhausted. I hadn't even opened my copybook and I was ready to go back to bed. Because you have to get dressed, you have to pour your cereal, you have to eat your cereal, you have to not spill your cereal, you have to walk out the door, you have to remember everything. So you're already wrecked. And I think just having a break, you know, my parents were great at just saying, just do what you want. Obviously, do your homework and do whatever, but just lie in front of TV, just relax. There was no pressure to I didn't do loads of activities. I did one activity on a weekend. So just keeping it really chill. I also find like routine is everything, and still at 28, if my routine has changed slightly, I'll have a freaker. So routine is so important, and that structure, because then your energy gets regulated and your body knows, oh, I have dancing on Monday, so I might have an extra snack, or I'll need a longer rest than on Monday evening and stuff. So that would be a huge one. And was the other one, Sharon, remind me about social? You're muted there.
You're still muted, Sharon.
I don't think she can hear us. Can you remember, Anya?
I think it was.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. So parents are saying that either their children can't make friends, doesn't want to make friends, but it's this whole thing about social interaction.
Yeah.
And I think parents tend to be more worried sometimes than their children are in certain ways about their children not having friends. So could you answer that from two perspectives? One, obviously your own experience, and then as you and I both know, that we would have calls from parents who say, my child has no friends.
And a huge one we would hear, especially at this time of the year when the kids have just gone back to school, they're not being invited on play dates and they're not being invited to the birthday parties. And that is really hard. And I think for me, it was outside of school activities where I would have found it easier to make friends. So Girl Guides, horse riding. I wasn't really into sports. Art class, even though I'm not good at art, but things like that weren't sports, and loads of movement where you were sitting beside someone, so you had to talk to them. It wasn't like go and get in a group yourself. So outside school things I think can be great as well, in your community, getting to know people. And I think like lots of kids have loads of friends and 5 or 6 best friends. I think it's okay if your kid has one best friend, and you just need to put that energy into doing the play date and let's go on a birthday trip with just the one friend, and just really nurturing that friendship. For me, that would have always been, I would have had 1 or 2 close friends and that was it. I didn't have a million friends, and I remember finding that hard in secondary school, thinking people had 50 friends, but they don't really. So I think it's just remembering 1 or 2 good friends to focus on, and at the end of the day, that's what you need.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Faye. Anya, would you like to come in there?
I think what they has said there, like, absolutely, to reiterate that, like, you know, and for some children who really struggle, like, that's the piece as well that I think, like, you know, and maybe, you know, this is the therapist in me speaking and the researcher as well, like, friendships are key. We don't want kids to have, it's not the piece about having loads of them, but actually some, and as Faye said, you make friends by being beside somebody doing something, that piece of it. So looking at the activity that's going to scaffold that. But it's also why you know, OT can be so helpful, because, like, actually, is there a group that they can join within it that is like, so down in Cork, if there's anyone in Cork, they had the WOW project, which is like all about, like, basically they did different leisure activities themselves, and it scaffolded it all, but the young people were really in charge. Like Dyspraxia Ireland runs different groups, but seeing what groups in your community maybe are supported a little bit, or which ones are, better isn't the right word, sorry, you can tell that it's late, but you know the way, so like for me, I know there's some groups that I think, like, just on a, I know I wouldn't recommend, because maybe it's a large club and it's a really big setting, okay? So, like, you know, the coaches there will have to do a lot to keep everybody on track. So sometimes looking at the size of the club and the activity and what they're doing, that actually just looking at going, does this suit the personality and my child's needs? Like, that actually those kind of smaller, kind of, you know, lower pace, like, if they're into, and I know with COVID things have been really reduced, but if they're into singing, like, is there a choir group, or is there something that is there, you know, that taps into theirs? Like, some kids love Pokemon, like, is there a Pokemon group in their local area? Like, whatever it is, like, tapping into their interests and preferences.
Thank you, Anya. And there was a comment in here. Thank you, Faye. Your input is invaluable, and it absolutely is, because I think it gives comfort to so many parents to hear from Faye, who's, you know, who's grown up with DCD, and as you can all see, an amazing, strong young woman here in front of us. Okay, we're at 5 past now, and Anya, I know you've been answering questions absolutely non-stop. There's one question here that I was a little bit, I'm not sure, I wasn't sure if I should ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And it's from a parent whose son keeps thinking that he's going to die. And I know that
no, I don't even laugh. I'm like, oh, thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, I know. What a way to end the night. And I'm not being flippant about this, but
no, neither am I.
It's not unusual for a child with DCD to have very fixed ideas about particular things. Whereas, you know, I might have an aversion to spiders or flies. There's been one flying around here all evening. You know, this is a very fixed idea, which is far more impactful as a parent than a lot of the other fixed ideas that children may have. So I thought, you know, I think we need to talk about this one.
Absolutely. So I suppose, you know, look, right, I suppose, first of all, I want to say I am not a psychologist. That is not my area of expertise. So I would say, you know, get some help and talk to somebody that is their area of expertise. You know, a child and adolescent psychotherapist or a child and adolescent psychologist, because that's not my area of expertise. So I'm a little bit reticent to answer it at all, because I'm conscious that it's recorded, and B, I'm conscious that I don't want to I don't know the context of this, okay? So on a broader context, like very broad, we would say that actually many children, not just kids with DCD, can actually have that anxiety and fear that they're going to die or that a family member is, okay? And sometimes in a real broad general piece, it's to talk to them about it, that actually they can actually just explore it and actually not be afraid to talk about it and to actually chat through and to say, and to kind of go, well, what is it about it? Like, you know, why you think, so that actually we can just help them to, because remember, from a cognitive perspective, they haven't got the brain skills to be able to rationalize, to problem solve. So we can just help them to rationalize it, to go, well, no, I don't think you're going to die, because actually, no, you eat a healthy diet, and, you know, and the pieces around what keeps you well. So like, there's no indicators of anything like that. And actually, you know, you're fit and healthy. So just that some of it that they can actually rationalize it, like, right, okay.
Yeah.
And then from a very broad general perspective, the other piece around it would be actually to say, you know, look, sometimes they'll have that thought and then their mind kind of races with it, like, right, okay. So, and it's like it gets stuck in their head. They can't think about anything else. So how do you shift and break that thought, okay? So that's where sometimes, like, you know, we might do breathing exercises, but sometimes the child may not be able to focus on the breathing exercises. So we might do something really physical instead, like, you know, to actually distract them, to actually say, right, I've been thinking about that now. Now I'm not going to give it any more space and energy, because actually that's just taking up space in my head. So in a way, it's like kind of like cognitive behavioral type techniques. But I would say, please go and seek specialist advice around that if you're concerned about it, because they are really general strategies that I've given there, and in no way specific, and it's not my area of expertise.
Just to add on that, Anya, we're hearing that a lot. So just so that parent knows, with COVID, that is huge. And it's becoming bigger and bigger now that the kids are back in school and are talking to their peers. This is a new thing we're seeing since COVID as well, this worry.
Yeah, absolutely.
See, I suppose that's one of the things I was going to say, is that like sometimes any child will have that where they'll talk about it, because if it's been part of their reality of where they've seen a family member die, you know, granny or granddad or somebody, or you know, they hear people talking about death and other people. So, you know, where before it was never in their everyday experiences, they're hearing about it now. So it's actually to be able to talk about that and to say, you know, to explain it to them, saying, you know, yes, you know, I understand why you're worried, but actually that's why we do the things of like hand washing and wear your mask. And actually we know that children don't get as sick with it, that it's typically older people. And that's why, you know, we take all these steps to keep ourselves well. So it is about, some of it's actually just about having those conversations so that they're not holding that worry in their head of like going, am I going to die? Or is somebody close to me going to die?
Yeah, I think just going back to Faith's point about the increase in calls that we've had, both from, and it's not even children, it's adults, it's younger adults as well, who are, you know, it's the impact of social isolation, and it's an anxiety that has grown from, whether it's, you know, not seeing your grandparents, not seeing your friends, all of those things. It's such an unusual circumstance that we haven't experienced ourselves in our lives growing up, that it definitely is something that we have seen an increase in. And I would agree that it's very important to take it seriously, but it's also very relevant that it's across the board. While we're hearing it, I can tell you that people in other organizations that we work very closely with, you know, the Disability Federation of Ireland, ADHD, Dyspraxia, they're all hearing exactly the same things. So it's very important. There's a lot of good apps out there, mental health apps. Mental Health Ireland is a great resource. Somebody put in the chat box here about breathing exercises, mindfulness, yoga, all of those things. Check them out. Very, very important. So, Anya, can I really test your time and ask you just one more question?
Okay, it has to be the last one, because honestly, I can hear it in my voice. I won't lie, I'm just tired.
I know, and you've been so good and so generous with your time this evening. This last one, and it's again really, really relevant to parents. What can we expect in the way of supports from school for a 7-year-old? We're still waiting for an IEP. Is there anything else we can expect?
Okay, So I suppose if the child has a diagnosis of DCD, okay, they meet the criteria then for, now please Faye jump in here as well, because I'm really conscious that actually you're more familiar with this even than I am, so please do jump in here. But to the best of my knowledge, according to the Department of Education, they're curricular, they're entitled to special education teaching hours, or what many of us might know previously as resource teaching hours. Okay, so entitled to support around that. And then in with that, then that is where the IEP should be tied in. So they're entitled to those two pieces.
Yeah, and I would say it's, to be honest, hit and miss with school, how busy the school is, how many children with whatever's going on they have. And you might just have to shout a bit louder and bang the door a bit harder to get your voice heard, unfortunately. But like, I would be pushing for an IEP and saying you need it now, and if that's not going to happen, take a step above and contact the CNO and so on. It just depends on the school and the child. Unfortunately, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Super.
Thank you so much, Faye. Thank you, Aine. I'm going to, two last things. First of all, I'm going to ask people for your input into the chat box for further talks that you would like to hear from us. There's been such a range and so many diverse questions this evening that your input will really help us to determine where we go next in relation to our talks. The second thing is a massive thank you to Aine, as always. Aine, you are just such a bright light in this space for parents, for adults with DCD. Your knowledge is impeccable, and your empathy and your passion for this just shines through all of the time. So we would really, really like to thank you so much, and look forward to speaking to you again. So we'll leave the, we're going to exit, but we'll leave the chat box open for a few minutes. If anybody would like to put in any ideas that they have. Again, if you've missed any of the links from this evening, and there was quite a few, please feel free to contact us on info@dyspraxia.ie. So we'd like to thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and talk to you all soon.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thanks, Faye. It's always a pleasure presenting with the two of you. So thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everybody who's come tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night, everybody. Bye.